Hello, my name is Kimberly Hugel, and we are delighted that you've joined us for the Dive In 2021. Welcome to Women at Work, The Great Return. Dive In is a result of the collaboration across the insurance industry. We are thankful to the 22 global festival partners you just saw highlighted in the video, and we would also like to say a special thank you to our local co-sponsors shown here for their financial, organizational, and volunteer support creating and running these events. The success of Dive In is down to the hundreds of volunteers who find time to organize these events while tending to their work and family obligations. We'd like to extend a huge thank you for their dedication and to congratulate them for creating a festival full of informative and inspiring discussions. We can't do this without your support. In this session, Women at Work, The Great Return, we focus in on why women in particular have exited the workforce, what can be done to support their re-entry, as well as providing a toolkit for individuals contemplating a return to work. To conduct this discussion, I'm delighted to welcome Dominique Moss, founder of a unique recruitment and consultancy firm, The Return Hub, and Richard Petz, author and professor of sociology at Ball State University. Joining us today to moderate their questions is Sarah Thorne, COO from the Return Hub. We're going to break to answer questions about 15 minutes before the close of the session, but we do encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the discussion. Now, before I hand you over to our speakers, I would just like to run a quick poll. Can you please bring up the poll on the screen? We'd love to know who we have here with us today and what brought you to this particular session. You should be able to see a poll coming up on your screen now. So we're going to give you a few moments to let people answer the poll, and as we do that, I'm going to hand over now to Dominique.
Thanks very much, Kimberly, and hello everyone. It's amazing to be here today speaking about such an important topic and with so many interesting speakers. Wow, the wonders of modern technology. It's great that so many of you could join us. While we give some time for people to complete the poll, I wanted to say a little bit about what qualifies me to be here today speaking to you. My name is Dominique Moss. I'm the founder of a unique search company called the Return Hub. We specialize in placing people, especially women, back into work in the financial services sector after a career break. And we work with lots of global companies, SMEs, startups, fintechs, companies in the financial services sector, and candidates that are off the radar of traditional search firms. We are very much based in the UK. The theme for this festival is active allyship, and a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis is about influencing and creating allies to help ease the pathway for firms to increase the representation of women in the financial services arena. We've done a lot of research in this area, and just before COVID struck, we embarked on a piece of research which focused on men's attitudes to diversity. And at that point, we found almost 3/4 of men, it was about 73%, believed flexible working was challenging for company productivity, regardless of gender. It's so interesting to reflect on that in the light of where we find ourselves today, post-pandemic. And I'm delighted to be here today with Professor Richard Petz. Over to you, Richard, to introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks, Dominique. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I'm super excited to be a part of this session. My name is Richard Petz. I'm a professor of sociology at Ball State University, which is in Indiana in the United States. I'm so excited to be part of this event because my research interests closely align with this theme of active allyship, about what we can do to improve women's employment. Much of my research focuses on the role that men and fathers can play in reducing gender inequality. I focus a lot on how workplace practices and policies may enable men to be more involved in domestic life, and how men's involvement in the home can ultimately reduce the burdens typically placed on mothers and ultimately promote women's employment opportunities. Most particular for this talk today, I've been engaged in research about how parents have been affected by the pandemic, collecting data at a few time points across the pandemic, particularly looking at how workplace changes and changes at home influence one another. And so I'll be presenting some of those results today. Before we get into sort of what we have to say about this topic, I first want to bring up the poll and see if we can see the results to find out who happens to be here today. Thank you. So it looks like, about a third of people in attendance are employers looking to encourage women back into the workforce. About 16% employees thinking about career changes, and then the mystery group. About half of attendees are here for some other reason. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk on a number of things that perhaps can reach you at some point in this talk. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Dominique.
And the pandemic has influenced the current landscape in an unprecedented way. And working within this sector, we've witnessed firsthand the impact that the pandemic has had on women and the workforce. To perhaps set the scene, in January 2020 in the UK, we were expecting a boom in economic activity. Brexit had just been decided with a decisive victory in the general election, leading to what we thought would be a stable majority government for the Tories and renewed confidence for business. Not just in the UK, but across the globe, we saw the pandemic have a huge impact on recruitment levels. Between about, March and June, recruitment across pretty much every sector, every level, was down about 80%. In November, we started to see firms try to reclaim some sense of normality. And hiring definitely did pick up again, and particularly with roles that the regulator had required to be filled anyway. But throughout that time, things have changed immeasurably in the UK. And a diminishing number of hires were female. Career development has fallen to the bottom of the list of the to-do list for most people as they adapted to working from home, online schooling, caring for elderly parents, caring for children in lockdown, and the fear and uncertainty, both personally and professionally, that created has caused a real problem. And in the UK, we're at the point where people are starting to go back to the office. I know obviously other parts of the world are a bit further ahead with that. But over here, we are seeing people now very much coming back into the office 2 or 3 days a week. Only 1 or 2 companies have pushed that back to January. But even over here, as we're seeing levels of infection increase on a daily basis, there's still much uncertainty. But despite all of this, we have seen through research found by us that the productivity has been maintained during this very difficult period. Hiring has returned, and we really do expect that to continue. I think every recruiter and headhunter I know is super busy at the moment, which is obviously very encouraging. There was some research that I saw recently from the US that said that 2.2 million professional women had left their careers during the pandemic. And I thought at this point it'd be interesting to highlight a poll that I'd seen during the pandemic conducted by the Diversity Project, which many of you may know. The Diversity Project is a leading campaigning group championing a more inclusive culture within the savings and investment profession. At the beginning of the pandemic, they asked in a poll, in an event that they were holding, does COVID present more of a threat or an opportunity to women? And at that time, so this would have been probably April 2020, 72% thought that it would be an opportunity, and just 28% thought that it would be a threat. However, mid-pandemic, around the same time that Richard started to conduct his research, this has changed considerably, with only 45% seeing it as an opportunity and 55% seeing it more as a threat. And I thought, Richard, would be interesting for you here to zero in on some of your findings.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. So as I mentioned, we've been tracking parents throughout the pandemic in the United States specifically, and we captured them early in the pandemic in April when everybody was in lockdown, and then again in November, and we're just getting ready to follow up with them again to see how things have changed. And as Dominique mentioned, in the U.S., employment rates were hit very hard, and both men and women were affected at first in the early days of the pandemic. But even though there were substantial rates of job loss for both men and women, we find in our study that mothers were substantially more likely to voluntarily leave their job than fathers. So while there were similarities in unemployment there were significant rates in terms of which parent was actually optionally choosing to leave their job or reduce their hours. So we asked parents who reported voluntarily leaving their job or reducing their work hours during COVID why they did this. And so these are the results from our November data. And as you can see, the most common reason why mothers left their job was because of caregiving response, with the majority of mothers cutting back on their paid labor force opportunities due to caregiving responsibilities. And mothers were over twice as likely to report leaving for this reason than fathers. The caregiving burdens, as Dominique sort of illustrated, for parents and mothers in particular during COVID have been immense. The closures in schools and childcare facilities and unique pressures on mothers to not only take on these additional roles, but to really prioritize domestic responsibilities during this stressful time. Although our studies in the UK and studies in other countries have shown that fathers have stepped up to do some work during the pandemic, mothers have still sort of bared the brunt of this increased responsibility. And so to illustrate what I mean by immense caregiving burdens, this slide illustrates the amount of time that parents spend on childcare on average in a given week by how this work is divided. So whether mothers do most of the childcare, whether mothers and fathers share childcare relatively equally, or whether fathers do most of the childcare. And particularly sort of striking is the sort of set of bars on the far left. What you can see is that in families where mothers are the primary caregivers, which is the majority of families in the United States and elsewhere, mothers reported spending almost 70 hours a week on childcare during the pandemic. Obviously, maintaining a career while spending 70 hours a week on childcare is difficult, if not impossible. And if you contrast this to the two bars in the middle, when parents share this work relatively equally, the time burden on mothers is greatly reduced when fathers share in these tasks. So fathers' willingness to participate in childcare can greatly help to alleviate the burdens placed on mothers. And so we were interested in understanding how these things went together to affect women's employment during the pandemic. And so looking at, the major job losses that happened early in the pandemic and how this affected women and men, what we find is that caregiving responsibilities are a huge factor for understanding women's employment during the pandemic. And we find that mothers' employment outcomes were far better when fathers were more involved at home. So looking at the early months of the pandemic, we see that mothers who were the primary caregivers, who did most of the childcare, they had a 50% probability of voluntarily reducing their labor force participation early in the pandemic. So on average, 1 of 2 women who were primarily responsible for childcare either left the workforce or reduced their work hours to sort of meet caregiving demands. In contrast, when caregiving responsibilities were shared equally between mothers and fathers, mothers had only a 15% probability of voluntarily leaving their job. So fathers' involvement at home has a huge impact on labor force participation. Similarly, if we look at work hours, mothers were able to work significantly more hours per week when childcare responsibilities are shared equally with fathers. And collectively, what the results from our study show is that increased caregiving burdens during the pandemic have pushed many women out of the paid labor force. Interestingly, as you can see on these two graphs, caregiving responsibilities has very little effect on fathers' employment. So whether fathers are doing way more or they're sharing equally, their employment opportunities were not affected nearly to the same extent as those for mothers. And so what this tells us is that not only is care work inherently gendered, but these responsibilities affect women's employment far more than men. And so we need to recognize this to understand women's departure from work, particularly in the context of the pandemic, and keep this in mind when we're developing strategies to facilitate their return to work. Dominique?
Thanks, Richard. It's really interesting research. Do you think there is anything in men, looking at what more traditionally female-focused policies such as extended maternity leave and flexible working has done to women's careers, that makes them reluctant to step forward and kind of put their hand up to take it on themselves? Or, I mean, obviously looking at what sort of flexible working and all this has done to women's careers, you could see that would sort of make men think, is that really the road I want to go down? Or do you think that the pandemic has knocked down the walls and there's a generation of men coming up, new fathers who have different expectations from those 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think both are true. Increasingly, more and more men are saying that they want to be more involved at home. They want to share these tasks equally. And we saw some of this during the pandemic. I think exposure to these kinds of things helped men to recognize how much work there is to do at home, and be willing to take on more of that work. And men increasingly express a desire to have um, uh, leave to take care of kids, and flexible, supportive workplace practices. But men often do not fully utilize these policies because they are fearful that doing so will harm their
Mm,
career. And so this
mm,
this disconnect, I think, creates a few problems. We know that these supportive policies help men to be more involved at home. So men do more housework, they do more childcare when they're able to work flexibly, at least sometimes, and they're more likely to share in these tasks with mothers when they have the ability to take leave, when they have the ability to have
mm.
these flexible policies. And so if men don't have access to these policies or feel like they can't use them, then women are left
Yeah,
to bear the burdens of these responsibilities. But we
yeah,
also know that men face more work-family conflict than they have in the past because they have to be more involved at home, and so being able to deal with this and balance this is more of a struggle for men and could impact their performance at the job as well.
yeah. And I think what employers need to be really careful of as well is that their policies aren't sending out two very different messages. Because, you know, if you have an extended maternity leave policy that says to women, you can, you know, your place when you had a baby, certainly in the UK, you have a legal right to have a year, you know, once you've done, I think, 2 years employment, you can take a year out. And when you've had a baby, you know, if the policy is saying really to the mother, your place is at home, you have a year's maternity leave that you can take, but the father is, you know, much less than that, perhaps 2 weeks, 2 months, something like that. The message to him is, really, your place is back in the office as soon as possible. And you know, the implications of those messages for both parties, domestically and professionally, is not to be underestimated, I think. And I think for it's almost the case that as a woman looking for a potential employer, they should be looking at what the parental leave is, what the paternity leave is, and what message they're sending to the fathers, as much as the message that they're sending to the mothers. But you know, obviously they have different. You know, different countries have different regulations around all of this, but it's a fascinating area. So certainly in the UK now, we're seeing on everyone's mind and many organisations, how do we get these women back, and what do we do to ensure that the progress that's been made around gender diversity, and I think we can all agree has been somewhat limited, does not slip back any further. So what I'm going to just talk about now is some of the, I suppose, the landscape, if you like. What are some of the barriers that are going on that make it very difficult for people returning, but you know, women returning back into the workforce to cut through? But also, what are some of the levers that are being pulled to change the status quo, if you like? And one of the things I wanted to really talk about today was the traditional methods of recruitment, and how, without knowing how recruitment works, you can very easily find yourself screened out of a recruitment process. So if we look at executive search or professional search, headhunters who are working on behalf of a company to find, let's say, a new head of sales or a head of trading or whatever it might be, and that headhunter will essentially map the market. They will identify a list of competitor organizations and target the individuals that do that job in those competitor organizations. And that's the shortlist. So you can see that if you're not in the market, you're not going to cut through in a traditional search process. You then have recruitment agencies at the volume end, which is very much where you might have 2 or 3 or 4 recruitment agencies all vying to fill a role. They all know that the square peg candidate for the square hole will most likely win the fee. And it's very difficult for the diverse candidate who might have a non-standard CV to really cut through. And then you have obviously jobs boards that have algorithms that filter the hundreds, if not sometimes thousands, of applications that a job advert will receive. into a manageable number by a human being. And those algorithms will very often screen out career breaks and sort of non-standard candidates. So you can see it's very difficult very often to cut through as someone who's returning to work. On the plus side, there are reasons to be optimistic. And again, I'm talking very much about the UK here. There's been a number of government initiatives to help really sort of help companies understand the importance of bringing more women back into senior roles and promoting the women that they have into senior roles. Things like the Women in Finance Charter, which was set up in 2016 by the UK Treasury. Things like the gender pay gap reporting, which asks all companies with 250 or more employees to report on their gender pay gap. That's shone a light in some fairly dark places sometimes. And actually, we're hoping to see that be enforced again this year, because it was actually the companies were let off last year because of the pandemic. There's also an awful lot of research that's gone into to basically proving the business case for diversity. I'm sure many of you will have heard of perhaps McKinsey's is the best known in their report Diversity Matters. But it's very well proven now through numerous studies that diversity is good for the bottom line, but it's also good for governance reasons and managing risk. So I think really we're seeing a lot of things that are going on now within industry to really focus on addressing this really big issue. And of course, one of the other things is the return to work programs. And there are now about 70 companies that are running a return to work program in the UK, specifically focusing on this issue. So there are three levers to pull if we're going to increase the representation of women at senior levels. Okay, we need to hire more, promote more, and retain them. Hopefully our proposition is fairly clear on the first of those things. We basically focus on placing women on a career back into work. But in our recent survey of female financial services professionals, career development opportunities were rated as the #1 priority when considering an organisation to work for. And we know that lack of career development opportunities is one of the main reasons that women leave their job. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, for so many women, career development has just not been a priority. And so I think for any CEO who's serious about closing this gap, ensuring that they're hiring, promoting and retaining women, and trying to do everything to stop slipping back on the somewhat limited gains that might have been made over the last 20 years, mitigating the damage to careers and ensuring progress for those women who are coming back into the office or who are coming back into work, that their career development is again a priority. Obviously, one of the other things that I think is on everyone's minds at the moment is what the future of work will look like. Will it be back to work full time in the office? Will it be a hybrid model? What does it really mean in practice? We're certainly having all of these conversations now with a lot of our clients, and it seems to be there's a sort of variety of different approaches. Some who are asking people to come back full time. I think they will probably struggle to do that. And I think also we will definitely see people vote with their feet if they are asked to come back full time. But many organisations are implementing a hybrid model with 2 to 3 days in the office. I think how it will actually work in practice remains to be seen, because of course everyone, from sort of more junior employees to senior employees will have different preferences and responsibilities and obligations. My own personal view is that whatever organisations do, they should put talent at the very heart of their decision making. And what can they do as an organisation to attract the very best talent? The wins and benefits from being an agile employer in terms of productivity and having a happier workforce, I think hopefully are obvious. So to attract women back, there does seem to need to be some positive action and some reframing of the conversation. There are many misconceptions about what a returner is. We capture a lot of data on our candidates when they register with us, so we know an awful lot about them. 67% of our candidates have 10 to 20 years experience. Many of them are available to start immediately, unlike other candidates that a company might be looking to hire who may have 3 or 6 months notice period. But of course, they're no less qualified or experienced and often more flexible than their peers in the market. Returners often have a different mindset and approach to work and bring additional valuable skills that they have developed. It's their diversity, their resilience, and their flexibility which sets them apart from the rest. We often find that these individuals who've taken a break, it doesn't sound like they've had much of a break because they've been entrepreneurs, helping friends with startups, doing courses, all sorts of interesting stuff that's actually increasing their skills and networks and their experience. We talk to firms a lot about what small tweaks they need to make to their existing processes to ensure that the benefits reaped during the pandemic are not lost and that we do not slip back. Richard, what are your thoughts around flexibility in the workplace and policies that enable women to better manage care responsibilities along with men?
Yes, I mean, I think in terms of tweaks, as you mentioned, I mean, your earlier point about policies that recognize and incorporate both men and women are fundamentally important. I thought your point about women should be looking at the flexible and family supportive policies that are offered to men as an indication of sort of how open to diversity that workplace is, I think is really interesting and fundamental, because oftentimes these policies get labeled as policies for women, which really help to perpetuate the disadvantage for women. So policies that incorporate both men and women help to ensure that women aren't pigeonholed in a particular way, placing them at a disadvantage in the workplace. I also think about, this theme of active allyship. Apparently I can't say that well. And the role that men play in terms of being allies, both at work and at home. I mean, obviously creating an environment within the workplace that recognizes that employees have diverse needs, that both men and women employees often have caregiving needs, have family life, have people that they're responsible for, and making the workplace an environment where your employees can manage work and family life. And so something as simple as, even if you're in a non-managerial position, just being open to talk about your family life sort of signals that talking about family and kids and elderly parents, whatever it may be, is acceptable within the workplace, which can create a more welcoming environment. And then obviously men need to be allies at home as well, and not just be welcoming to women in the workforce and then go home and do nothing. That these things are inextricably related. Obviously, the companies can't force their male employees to do more housework, but men can take it up. Homework for everyone. This is part of your overtime, doing dishes. But men taking ownership of these tasks and recognizing that the more that they do at home, the more time, the less burden and the less stress it's going to create on their partners, and on a larger scale that helps to improve employment opportunities for women as well.
I think that we are seeing that from a sort of different generational aspect, and certainly, I mean, a small number of data points, but conversations that I've had with men of a younger generation than me who've got sort of much younger children than I have, sort of nursery age children, or in primary school, who is saying to me that when they've accepted a job, it's been on the basis that they will be able to take their child to nursery or pick them up, maybe not every day, but certainly as equal participants with their wives or their partners. And I think what's interesting is of course it's very difficult for a company to have a policy on the one hand that talks about flexible working and bringing, hiring, retaining and promoting women, but at the same time they're not having the policies that allow the men to do the same thing. And I think there's a generation of men who are now talking to their bosses and their employers, whether it's at interview stage or up when they've become fathers, who are saying, actually, there's some flexibility that I want here now too, in a way that perhaps 10 years ago wasn't happening. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's clearly a shift happening, and increasingly, as you said, men want these policies and recognize that they're important. And so I think, if we think about policies that enable men to have more flexible work arrangements and the desires to do so, we can think about sort of the ideal worker and the ideal parent as sort of being, closely related, and you sort of need to change both, right? So if we sort of start to change our perceptions in organizations that it's not just women who need to take time off or need to leave a few minutes early to pick up their kids, but it's men too, then we might also be able to start to think about, well, it's not just men who should be sent overseas for that professional development opportunity. It should be women too. And so I think if we start to offer more equal policies in regard to sort of the family-friendly kinds of things, then I think it should also translate into more equal policies in terms of the career development kinds of things, which you're talking about as being a big reason for why women are leaving the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think there's too often there's the assumption that's made about a woman not wanting to go on that stretch assignment, not wanting to go to that pitch overseas, all of those things that kind of they may not even be aware of. Those decisions are being made on their behalf, and potentially by a well-meaning boss who's making some assumptions about their level of ambition. And I think that's absolutely something for all hiring managers, bosses, leadership teams to be aware of, is that, don't make assumptions about the level of ambition of your female employees, and particularly once they've had children, because I don't think they leave their ambition in the labour ward with them. Certainly many don't. But let's move on now to just, we've obviously talked a lot about what companies can do to help attract people back, but let's now move on to look at what individuals can do to help themselves. When they're looking to return to work, it can feel very daunting. And for so many, I think, people, it's where do you begin? Where do you even begin? And it's a massive topic. We run regular events and webinars talking about nothing but this. So we could talk for a very long time about the things that you can do. But here, I think what we're going to do is try and distill that down into some of the real essentials. But also what we're going to do is point you towards the Career Academy. Now, the Career Academy is a totally free suite of online digital tools on the Return Hub website, which you can find at thereturnhub.com. You just put your email address in and you get a code, and then you can go and have a play around with it. But there's all sorts of resources there, from recordings, mini masterclasses on how to do your CV, how to do your LinkedIn profile, interview skills, lots of content, resources, blogs, situational judgment tests, virtual elevator pitch builders, all sorts of great stuff. So it's a huge topic. We can't possibly cover it all in this session. So I would just point you towards the Career Academy on the Return Hub website. I think the first thing to do in thinking about a job search is do your research. Get together your marketing with collateral. And when you're ready, get in touch with your network. And what we mean by doing your research is really sort of investigate what are those companies that you really want to work for? What are those firms that really interest you? And even just nailing down what are those 3 or 4 roles that you think you can do, and what are your key skills and experience that's going to get you there. And obviously your key marketing material is your CV and your LinkedIn profile. And I can't tell you how many CVs we see that bear absolutely no resemblance to the amazing person and their experience and their skills and what they've done and what they've achieved. It really is, it really is your chance to make a good first impression. So it's super important to get that right. There's lots of advice you can get from all sorts of different people who'll tell you what a CV should or shouldn't look like. But as I say, I would point you in the direction of the Career Academy, and go and have a look there, and you'll get loads of help and support. Get up to speed with industry topics. Understand what's going on in your sector. You can do that through networking, asking people to come and have a coffee with you, connect on LinkedIn, follow journalists or people that are writing about your industry on Twitter. And this will really help you gain a sense of agency over your own direction. So I'm now going to just see if we can run this video. And Luke, I'm not sure whether you can help me here, whether this is something that I need to do or you need to do. But hopefully I'm currently showing, it's working. Here we go. This is basically some clips of the Career Academy site, which is now playing. It's a snapshot of some of the tools you can use depending on where you are in your journey. You can search the bank of tools to quickly bring up the right advice. I think you just saw there a template for the CV writer to make that much easier. But basically, it's the tools that you can use to quickly bring up the right advice at the right time. But the key thing really is to find the Career Academy includes things like masterclasses on CV writing and interview techniques, CV templates, all sorts of good stuff. So you can see the career development tools, networking, how to network virtually. I think the key thing for networking virtually is make sure that you're going to relevant events. Take the same care and attention that you would in attending a virtual event as you would in an in-person event. I heard so many stories last year of people who are when they went into lockdown, were accepting invitations to every event they'd been asked to online. And actually found that half the time, if it wasn't necessarily relevant, they would sort of come in the first bit, go off, make a cup of tea, come back, and not really focusing on what, getting the most out of that event. So approach it in the same way that you would an in-person event. Make sure that you are thinking, would I buy a train ticket to go to that event? Would I sort of, put on my professional clothes, and would I go and stand around having a drink with these people? And then when you do go to those events, you'll really make sure that you get the most out of it. And obviously at the end of those events, connect, get on LinkedIn, see who was there, speakers, follow them on social media. All this sort of stuff will give you a good opportunity to increase that network. So I think we're now coming up to Q&A. Unless, Richard, there was anything else you wanted to say.
No, I think I'd love to see what questions the audience has for us.
Brilliant. Okay, here we go with Slido. Okay, so the first question, what would you recommend as the single most important change that a company can implement to attract and support women back into business? Shall I answer that one? So I think I would say that the single most important thing that a company can do to attract and support women back into business is to really have a look at your recruitment strategies. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about traditional recruitment methods. Traditional recruitment methods, particularly that mid and senior level in financial services, e.g. executive search and recruitment agencies, they're fishing in a pool that is essentially pretty much 80% male, that will vary slightly depending on what exactly the role is, but it's pretty much 80% male. And so, of course, the results that you have when you hire people are going to reflect that. There are also, certainly in the UK, 300 companies now that have signed the Women in Finance Charter. They've all set targets. They've all committed to reporting on achieving those targets. The simple maths means they're not all going to achieve those targets by hiring from each other. They have to look at new pools of talent. And the returner talent pool is an amazing one. And it's not just returners who you might think of as people who've had a planned career break to raise a family. In my experience, these people are a bunch of complete overachievers who, whilst having a family, are also helping a friend with a startup, being entrepreneurs, doing further study. Sometimes they're not taking a break to raise a family. They're going off to go and do other exciting things, work abroad, work for an NGO, all sorts of exciting things, do further study. But you also have a group of people who are the career transitioners, who are in a role already, who want to do something slightly different using their skills in a transferable way. And they too are excluded from traditional recruitment methods, because that, again, is all about doing the job you do now and doing the same thing somewhere else. So really have a deep dive, think about what your recruitment practices are. What are they really doing for you as an organization? And there are some things you can do to really tap into a pool of candidates that's very different from the ones that you're seeing through those traditional methods. What I would say is be prepared for it to take a bit longer and put your hands in your pockets, but really think about making the same level of investment into this candidate pool and these hires as you would into the traditional pool that you would use traditional recruitment methods for. That's a very long answer, isn't it? Hopefully helpful. Let's have
I don't know
question.
the answer. The second question I think is interesting. How can I advocate for myself to have a flexible schedule going forward? What type of leverage works best? I think the times are interesting in that for many people, you now have some data to demonstrate your productivity when you weren't in the office, because many of us were working from home during the time period of the pandemic. So I might use that as an opportunity, to sort of approach your boss and say, hey, I demonstrated that I could be very productive working from home, at least part, and offer to sort of do a trial run. Say, hey, I would really like to do this, and I would like you to sort of test this out. Ask your employer for some benchmarks that your employer would like you to reach during a particular period of time, a week, a month, whatever it may be, on a trial basis, and show and seek to not only meet those benchmarks, but exceed those benchmarks. I think, these decisions are often made sort of about assumptions, that if you work from home, you're going to use it to sort of do other things and not spend time on work and not be as productive. And so I think if you can demonstrate that you are just as, if not even more productive by having that flexibility, then a sensible manager should want you to be as productive as you can be and put you in an environment to do so. So I might sort of start with the case that you had from COVID, and maintaining that productivity, and sort of ask for a trial to demonstrate that it works for you.
Senior hiring manager in one of the banks a couple of years ago on this topic of flexible working. And actually, he was an individual who had a lot of people in his team who were working flexibly, not just women, not just mothers. He had a PhD student in his team who was doing 3 days a week, so he could do his PhD 2 days a week. He had some people doing sort of 4 days a week, some people doing full time, but 1 day for him. So he already had a culture of flexible working. But what he said to me was, anyone that I want to bring in has the opportunity to work flexibly. But what I don't want to hear is why that's going to be a problem for me. What I want to hear is, why is that a solution for me? And that kind of totally made sense. It's why is this going to work for our business, you working flexibly? And I think if you can present it in those terms, and also with a flexible approach yourself, so it's, if there's always a sales meeting on a Monday morning at kind of 8 a.m. or something, obviously it'd be great if you could attend that 8 a.m. sales meeting. If there's going to be occasions when there's going to be extra work that needs to be done, or a trip on the day that you're not working, all that sort of thing, I think coming across as somebody who's going to be flexible on both sides makes it much easier for a hiring manager or a manager to see how that's going to work for them. And ultimately, the benefits to them of a happy workforce really does mean a more productive workforce, and a workforce that you hopefully can retain. So I think a lot of it is really simply is presenting flexible working as a solution rather than a problem.
Absolutely.
Where are we now? Why is it so difficult for companies to pay equal pay for equal work? If they hire people in making the appropriate compensation, wouldn't this close the gap? Well, obviously the equal pay gap in the UK was in the early 70s, and so it's been illegal for companies to not pay equal pay for equal work for many decades. The gender pay gap is really about the average pay of men versus the average pay for women. So taking all the women's pay and all the men's pay and seeing where the differences is. And really what that shows us is that there's many, many, many more men in the higher paid jobs and many, many more women in the lower paid jobs. And that's really what the gender pay gap tells us here. So really the way to solve that is to not necessarily bring in loads of women into the graduate ranks, because obviously that's going to actually widen the pay gap. It's actually going to be figuring out how do you bring more women back into work, into those mid and senior level roles, which again, the returner pool is, absolutely the right one to help solve that particular problem.
If I could add to that, in the U.S., we don't report gender pay gap nearly to the same extent as UK. Unfortunately, I wish we did. But we find evidence that the gender pay gap exists within occupations, within industries. It's far more widespread in the U.S., I think, than in the UK context, due to a lack of regulations. And I think a big part of it isn't just hiring people in at the same pay, which I think could be monitored, as the person who posed that question asked, but it's what happens beyond that point. It's assumptions that employers make about productivity. It's women are more likely to take days off when their kids are sick. And so when you make the decision about who gets to go overseas or who gets the promotion or who gets the big client, is that going to men more so than women? And over time, this really sort of exacerbates the pay gap between men and women. And so, yes, it's much easier to hire people in at a similar pay rate, but then what happens once people are in those positions, and how are they treated, and what assumptions are made? And so I think the things that we've talked about earlier are really important to be mindful of, and avoiding those assumptions to help maintain gender equality in pay within an organization.
Absolutely right. I completely agree. It's how do you avoid this sort of almost a sort of death by a thousand cuts, the sort of little micro things that happen every day that go into undermining a woman's ability to advance in a career in a way that perhaps doesn't happen to the same extent to men. And you're absolutely right. Those things like going overseas, doing the stretch pitch, all of those things. So I think as an employer, as a manager, I completely agree with you, Richard. Those are the things to be really mindful of. And now more so than ever, as we return back into the offices post-pandemic, I think one of the things, obviously, that we have to be really careful about with flexible working is that we don't end up with a two-tier system, where you have men going back into the office and women being back at home. Essentially, what will happen is it'll be exactly the same as it always used to be. But the women are doing still doing the domestic and the professional work. They're just doing it from home, and therefore they're not even in the room anymore. And they're not around the table anymore. And I think this is one of the things we need to be really, really, really careful about, and really, really sure about. And I would say to everyone who is thinking about what their working patterns can be, and if you have an employer who's flexible, just be really mindful that there will be advantages to being present in the office if that's where the decisions are being made in your organization. So yeah, and I think much of how the world of work will evolve for good and bad, we won't really know until 3 or 4 years' time. So a lot of this is probably best guesstimates, hopefully intelligent best guesstimates, but it will certainly be interesting to see what the implications are over the next few years. And I'm sure, as is often the way with these things, there will be some unintended ones.
Absolutely.
So next questions. Gosh, we've got loads of questions here. Just trying to quickly look through and see which one to pick next. It's like a lucky dip of questions.
What about the question about stopping work during COVID? I'm curious your perspective on that. How should women in particular handle that? Sort of the cases I was talking about, right? So all this hit, yeah. And women were more likely to leave the workforce. They took on the caregiving responsibilities. Now they want to go back. How do they explain that to employers and alleviate the concern that, if something happens, I'm not just going to leave again because that's my job, right?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I think you should just put plans. I mean, we always say to all of our candidates who've taken a career break, you just put planned career break on your CV, because your CV is really the place to showcase your professional skills and ability. And I think most employers that you would want to go and work for would understand why you might have needed to take a break during COVID. If they don't understand that, I think you'd have to ask yourself, are they really going to be the employer that I want to work for? Because I think it's an entirely reasonable thing to say at this rather extraordinary time in history, that actually online schooling and doing my job is all too much. And, for whatever reason, I decided to take a step back and focus on my family in this unprecedented time. But now this is in place, that's in place, and I'm ready to come back to work. And so I really would focus on, wouldn't focus too much on what, the whys and the wherefores, just literally put planned career break, the dates on your CV, and focus on your professional skills and experience. And, think about as well, when you get an interview, what are the things you can take from that time? I mean, I'm sure we've all learnt stuff about ourselves. I've learned that I was never cut out to be a teacher during COVID. failed to learn any new skills on that front, I'm afraid. But I'm sure there are things we've all learned about ourselves and that we can, we can take and use as a positive, in an interview situation in the future. And in terms of returning on the same or more money as I was on before, I would say that everyone should expect to be paid fairly for the role that they're going into. And that's really where your benchmark should be. What are your peers in that organization for that role that you're going for? What are they getting paid? And that's really, I wouldn't worry about whether you should take a pay cut because you've had a career break. If you're going in to do a job and it's, whatever the job pays, that's what you should expect to get paid. And I certainly wouldn't be advocating that, one after a relatively short career break, if this is what it's been, it could only be a maximum 18 months, I should think, that would mean that you needed to take a pay cut. Obviously if you're moving into a different sector or a different kind of role, that's one thing. But if it's exactly the same thing again, I would try and maintain the level of pay as you were on before. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Richard? Or I probably
No, I don't have great advice. I was curious to see your advice. I thought it was a great question. I knew this was much more in your wheelhouse than in mine.
Yeah. So let's have a look at another question. So you noted that most men believe that flexible work is challenging to productivity, yet workers increasingly want flexible work. How do you reconcile? Yes, thank you very much for that question. I think really the survey, the piece of research that we did about men believing that flexible work is challenging for productivity was done pre-pandemic. And it would be my strong view that for a lot of people, productivity during the pandemic did not go down. There are an enormous amount of efficiencies that are created by technology. My own business, I know candidate interviews, client meetings, you whistle through them in a day, in half an hour, in a way that would have taken 2 hours out of my day to travel to the meeting, have the meeting and come back again. So there are lots of efficiencies that have actually maintained or increased productivity through flexible working. And if we talk about flexible working, what we're really talking about is working from, flexible working can cover all sorts of different types of working. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to, for the purposes of my answer, a full-time role, but with flexibility, working from home or late starts, early finishes, whatever it might be. But the key thing I think about all of this is this productivity has been maintained in extraordinary times. So it's not just about saying, has productivity been maintained during with flexible working from home? It's actually been maintained whilst also having to juggle childcare, online school, elderly parents, online shopping, new technology, grappling with all of these things. So imagine what that could be like without all of that. Without all of that extra burden of managing everything on the domestic front as whilst you're also supposed to be at work. That's how I reconcile these two.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great point. And I think, the question earlier about how do I approach wanting flexible work with my employer, I see a question up there about, as a dad supporting my partner, and my office wants me back full time. How do I sort of make the case so it doesn't hurt my career? I mean, I think that's the angle, right? If you can say I was productive remotely despite all of this insanity and all of this stress, and trying to sort of deal with that and understand that stress and cope with that stress while being good at my job, then, when I can just focus on my job and life is not completely, I have to figure everything out anew, I'll be able to be that much more focused and that much more productive. And so I think the fact that we have maintained worker productivity, I don't know that this is necessarily a good thing from a personal well-being perspective, but from an employer perspective, it's a very good thing. We've sort of maintained a high level of work productivity in conditions that are simply not conducive to that. And so that should present to employers that this works, that flexibility works.
I think that's right. And if there are any employers out there who don't think that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to reinvent the world of work in a way that hasn't happened for 70 years, then they're missing a trick. the time is now. It is a unique opportunity. We've made so much progress in this direction over the last 18 months in a way that I think would have probably taken, I don't think it would be too much to say, possibly 20 years. When I think about how little progress has been made in other areas in the last 20 years. So I think, it is a unique opportunity, and it's very, very exciting to see what employers are doing to enable a much more flexible or hybrid working arrangement. I'm also aware that as the clock is ticking down, we only have just under 3.5 minutes left. And Kimberly, I know you wanted to say some closing remarks. So I'm going to hand back to you now, Kimberly.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Dominique and to Richard. Just a wonderful, wonderful session. A lot of great information. You can find more information about both of them and links to the other resources on their speaker pages on the Dive In Festival website. Please help us continue the conversation by sharing what you learned here with colleagues, friends, and family, and on social media. For social media, please include hashtag DiveInFest and hashtag Active Allyship. As the world recovers from the global pandemic, we hope that Dive In 2021 has provided the insight and tools required for us to become more active allies and champions for every single person in the insurance sector. Thank you so much for joining us for Dive In 2021.